Arcanum by Cor Al-Aran, Chapter 3, Part 2. Junior didn't have any work for her in the morning. He claimed it was because no one wanted to cause trouble with the Arcanist about, but she knew it was more that he didn't want to. Normally, she'd have balked at the loss of income, but they had enough from what she'd earned before to get by, and she needed to find a way to the Upper District today anyways. That alone was the kind of thing that would get most dredgers killed or imprisoned. If I don't, I'm going to be found by the Arcanists in the slums eventually. I have to get rid of this thing before they realize the young boy they're looking for is actually a girl. Vale's districts weren't made equal. That was obvious to anyone in the lower quarter, but it continued upward as well. It wasn't overly hard to get from the lower to the merchants. The gates were guarded and watched carefully, but the walls weren't. They relied on size and intimidation to keep the dredgers out. But like everything in the slums, they were ill-maintained and prone to water damage. Some had been damaged so badly that tunnels had formed. Ruby avoided those. People tended to live in them, and the guards knew where they all were by now and watched the other ends. Instead, she took to climbing the wall itself. Or not the wall, but the buildings close to it, which were a little less sheer. It wasn't hard to find a few handholds, and she was light enough to get up and over. The balconies looking down into the slums were abandoned, obviously. No one wanted to see them. The merchants' quarter was 100 times better than the lower district, but it still wasn't entirely safe. Oh, it was better, obviously. There were more guards, better homes, and less crime. But it was also right next to the slums, and you couldn't ignore that. Patrols stuck to the areas they needed to look after, namely the markets, banking houses, and residential districts. The quieter areas off by the slums were a middle ground. It was where the poor of the merchants' quarter, who were still far wealthier than any of them down below, lived. Sticking to the shadows and dark alleyways, Ruby made her way westward over towards and then along the river. Crossing it would be impossible. The bridges were well guarded and the water was strong enough to carry you back down to the slums, as it did much of the waste from the upper districts. Luckily, the upper quarter was next along and covered both sides of the river, meaning she didn't need to get across to reach the walls. The problem was getting through the walls. People said the upper district was where the real Vale began. The merchants' quarter was nice, but it was where you went to shop, full of foreigners, merchants, and peddlers, which many saw to be almost as bad as dredgers themselves. It was a middle ground given only as much attention as needed by the guards, whereas the upper district marked the real start of civilized life. The walls were solid and tall, watched by several towers evenly spaced out with bells set in each, ready to ring the alarm at the slightest sign of trouble. 3 large gates manned both the east and west side of the river, and they were all guarded by a garrison of well-trained guards. Not incorruptible guards, as Junior knew, but certainly by the standards of what wealth she had on her. Attempting to bribe them with the paltry amount of lien she had would get her beaten and thrown in her face if she was lucky, more likely beaten and tossed in the river. That tended to get rid of the undesirables, either carrying them back down to the slums or getting rid of a body entirely. Ruby bit her lip as she checked the 3rd gate. It was just as well guarded as the first 2. She watched as a wooden cart rolled up to it and stopped. 2 guards moved forwards with large halberds and spoke to the driver. They then walked around to the back and removed the covering, checking supplies and even poking wrapped-up bundles of cloth with tips of their weapons. One even looked under, making sure no one was clinging to the bottom. Satisfied, they waved the man on and stopped the next. Is it always this thorough, or is it just because of what's happening in the slums? It didn't really matter either way, since sneaking a ride on a wagon was obviously out of the picture. Sneaking through it all was going to be difficult. There just wasn't enough room to do so, and the walls didn't have any buildings nearby. She was a good climber, but not that good. There has to be some way through. There was a good chance Junior knew of a way, something he wanted to keep to himself, and not use lest the guards find it. He wouldn't tell her, not for something like this. She didn't have the time to check every inch of it either, and crossing the river wasn't going to work. Unless... Hurrying back the way she came, Ruby darted through the crowds, ignoring those who called out insults and running away at the smallest glance of a guard. Cutting across empty streets required looking both ways to make sure no one was watching, and while the locals sneered and shied away from her, few dared to call her out. They didn't know how dangerous she might be. The river running through Vale, known only as the River Vale, was fairly calm in the summer months. It got worse over winter and deadly in the spring when the floods came, but for the first few months after that, it was gentler and lower. Looking along it to the point where it passed through the walls, Ruby saw the metal bars that cut down from an arched opening where the stone had been built over the water. It wasn't a single arch, but 5 in total, with stone pillars reaching down into the water at intersecting points. The bars looked solid from a distance, and she doubted any would have rotted entirely. The gaps were too narrow for a normal person to fit through, but she wasn't normal. Short and thin, the gaps might just be wide enough. There were a few people further down on the river washing clothing in the water or collecting buckets full. Some further down pissing into it, ignoring what that might mean for the dredgers further down. Ruby grimaced and found a spot close to the wall, directly under it where anyone watching from above wouldn't be able to see her. The water was cold as she dipped a foot in. Grimacing, she fought the urge to pull it back, and instead stepped in until she was submerged to her shins. The current was strong, made all the more so because of how the water was stopped by the wall and forced through the narrow culverts. It evened out a little further down, but that didn't mean much for her. The current would be at its strongest exactly where she wanted to push through. And if anyone was watching on the other side... Can't think of that. Be brave, Ruby. You can do this. Yang and she knew how to swim. You couldn't live in the lower quarter and not. When the floods came, those who didn't know how inevitably learned or drowned. Swimming upstream was harder, though. Ruby waded through the river as far as she could, keeping her back to the wall and crouching low to avoid detection. At least until the water became so deep she couldn't crouch and keep her chest above it. She shivered at the plunging temperature and ought to keep her footing as water rushed against her back and threatened to force her down and under. She was still a good 3 or 4 feet from the metal bars. Now or never, she thought, taking a few breaths and preparing herself. Any longer and she risked being spotted, or whisked away by the current. With her final breath, Ruby sealed her lips shut and dove to the side along the wall. Her arms hit the water first, followed by her head, but she kicked with both legs and held onto a rock, dragging herself through the rushing river that stung her eyes. Though hazy, she could make out the indistinct shape of the bars. Reaching out desperately, she strained to reach one. Her fingers almost touched it. A fresh barrage from the river struck her shoulder and knocked her back. Her legs sailed out uselessly, and it was only her fingers digging into the rock that kept her in place. Eyes stinging so bad she had to close them, Ruby flailed with her free hand until she found the same rock, then scrambled for a grip. Using both hands, she pulled herself against the current. Her lungs were burning. Just a little further, she was so close. The pain was unbearable, but she forced herself on, pulling her body up and getting a foot on the rock, then lunging forward, falling into the current and almost being sent somersaulting backwards. Her hands hit metal. Wrapped around it, one arm hooked through and behind, holding her in place as she kicked up towards the surface. Ha! She gasped, poking her head through and drawing as much air as she could. Hanging onto the bars, her body was battered by the rushing water that came faster and faster than ever, forced through a narrow checkpoint. It splashed up into her face and mouth, making her sputter. Her body wanted to rest, but she couldn't let it, all too aware that she'd become exhausted just holding on. With another breath, she dived down again. Working one hand through the bars was easy. Working the second, then her shoulders, was harder. A part of her mind brought up the image of her stuck between the bars, caught between her shoulders and hips, and held there underwater until she drowned. They'd maybe find her a week later when she began to rot, trapped between the bars. The fear galvanized her, and she struggled through, all too thankful for her narrow and underdeveloped hips that slipped through just with a little wiggle. The rush of water was less on the other side. Bracing her feet against the bars, Ruby was able to kick off into the side. She was swept back against the wall, but thankfully not through the bars once more. Dragging herself along the base of the river, she was able to crawl her way to the shallows and then stand, gasping for breath as she came out exhausted and collapsed into the bank. The soft grass cushioned her fall, and she lay there in the shadows of the wall, shaking and panting with her clothing stuck to her body. Something poked against her shoulder. "Is it dead?" "Hit harder!" Ruby wanted to protest, but could only yelp from a swish, followed by a crack, heralded by a thin piece of wood striking her back. Her wet shirt dulled the blow slightly, but it still left a stinging line against her flesh. "Ow!" she hissed, glaring up. There were 2 boys nearby, younger than her, maybe 10 or so. One of them had a long thin stick he had used to hit her. The other was half hidden behind him. Both were dressed in finery she could only dream of. Rich purples, greens, and blues with silver belt buckles, yet their trousers were covered in grass stains regardless. They were plump and ugly, though that might just have been their expressions. "It's from below," the one hiding said. "Is it a dredger? Mom told me they're born in rivers and left there by their mothers. Only those who can drag themselves out survive. Disgusting, the first said. Does that mean this is a newborn one? Ew, we don't want to hear. Push it back into the river. The first used the stick against her shoulder, trying to push her back into the water. Ruby growled and fought back. Normally, she'd have had no issue, but she was tired, soaked, and starving as it was. They'd managed to force her a few inches until she dug her feet in and scowled at them. Piss off, she hissed, trying to sound like Yang, or I'll break your knees. You can't talk to me like that! The first brought the switch up and struck down at her. Ruby panicked and curled both hands over her head a second before it struck. The stinging lash caught the back of her neck and her hand. I'm the first son of Melrose Dupont! Take this, and this! He brought the stick down 2 more times, once on her head and the second time on the small of her back. I'll have you flayed for your insolence, he squealed, getting the word wrong. I'll strip the skin from your back, Ruby caught the stick on the next strike and pulled sharply. The boy stumbled forward and was unprepared for her to shift it to the side and jab it forward again. The end of the branch caught him firmly in the face, right between his nose and his mouth. At best, he split his lip, but the kid fell back with a stunned expression. She took the time to toss the branch away and climb onto one knee. You hit me! You struck me! I'll do more than strike you, she wheezed, water dripping from her hair and clothes. Her back stung, and she thought there might have been some blood. I'll beat you black and blue. It's a barbarian, the second whispered, tears in his eyes. She wasn't sure why, seeing as she hadn't even hit him. Yet. The boys burst into tears and scrambled to their feet, running away screaming about telling their father how she would regret it. Ruby watched them go and slumped against the wall, using it to rest as she wrung out at her top, pouring water into the grass. Gotta keep moving, she thought dully, wanting nothing more than to take a break. Guards would have heard something, assuming they don't run straight to them. And she was in the Upper District, of course. If her clothing didn't give her away, the fact she was soaked certainly did. Ruby checked her pocket and was unsurprised to find the cube still there. It probably slipped out when she'd been pushing through the bars, but it would have come back. The longer she spent, the more risk there was of being caught. This wasn't like the merchant's quarter either. There were less people to blend in with, and guards all over the place. To the north, above the walls, she could even see the spires of the Arcane Collegium. Before, it had always stood as a place of wonder. Now, it cast a looming shadow. Inside, the sanctum stood. I'm not going there, she hissed, trudging on. I'm not.